Okay, great. Our first speaker today is Ariadna Murguia-Berthier. She's a graduate student at UC Santa Cruz working with Enrico Ramirez Ruiz on high-energy astrophysics. She studied all aspects of the binary neutron star merger, from formation of the binary through common envelope to the merger itself, using GR-MHD simulations with neutrinos and the merger product of short GRBs. She's expecting to graduate in May, and she's applying for postdocs. She's really interested also in outreach, particularly with people from Latin origins and for children. She's been the graduate outreach leader for several years and helped organize events such as La Noche de las Estrellas for Latino students. So Ariadna, take it away.
Thank you very much for the lovely introduction. Let me just share my screen. So can everyone see it? Great, awesome. Thank you. So today I will be talking about how stars disappear without a trace and how to use that in order to constrain their angular momentum. This is work that I've done with collaborators all over the globe. So let me talk first about some disappearing stars that we have found. So the first one that I'll talk about is N6946BH1. This is a 20-30 solar mass star that was found in a very dusty galaxy. Here I'm showing the luminosity of that star as a function of time. So as you can see, first, it's nice, it's just normal. And then at some point, there's a weak optical outbursts followed by an increase in 5 magnitudes. And it's actually up until 2020, it's still disappearing. So the star just disappeared without a trace. The other disappearing star, PHL293b, is a luminous blue variable. Here, what I'm showing is the H alpha and H beta. This is the spectra. And what I'm showing here in the dotted line is an X-shooter spectra, and overplotted is the VLT spectra. And this is just, again, as a function of time. So what I want you to notice is that at some point in 2011, this star that used to have these wings right here just stops having these wings. And this is the luminous blue variable eruption. So this is like the signature of the LBB, and it just disappeared. Now, the authors did some radiative transfer modeling, and they concluded that this progenitor is around 80 to 100 solar masses, so it's ginormous. So one of the possibilities for N6946BH1 is that it was obscured by a dusty shell from a companion, but that has actually been ruled out because it is inconsistent with late-time evolution. Another option for this particular star is that it could be a stellar merger, where the envelope is ejected at very low velocities. And there's also formation of dust, which would explain the high dusty galaxy where they found it. But the problem with that scenario is that this would have definitely been a luminous transient, and we didn't see anything. So no stellar merger. Now for PHL293b, this one is actually in the range for the pairing stability supernova. In that case, there are electron-positron pairs that form in the core of the star, which takes away thermal energy or pressure, which makes the gravity then win, which reduces the size of the core, increases its temperature, it forms more pairs, and this process just repeats itself. This is a runaway thermonuclear explosion that destroys the entire star and leaves basically no remnant. This option has been rejected though, because that would have definitely caused a transient. Now, another option for this particular one is just that the LBB is quiescent right now, and it will explode again, erupt later. So the thing that I will focus on is another scenario that applies to both of them, and it is a direct collapse to a black hole. So in this case, I'm showing a caricature. This is just the helium core, and I'll divide it in shells so that it's simpler to understand. So first, the star ends its fuel. Its iron core collapses and it turns into a black hole. And then another shell of material is going to get accreted onto the black hole. But what happens as more material gets accreted, if the material has no angular momentum, everything is just spherically symmetric, and the material will just be directly accreted onto the black hole. Because the black hole has no surface, any dissipated energy is going to be advected directly into the black hole, and there will be no appreciable feedback. On the other hand, if there is high angular momentum, there's going to be material that orbits around the black hole for a little bit, and a disk will be formed. There are magnetic torques that will draw material from the disk onto the black hole, and that loss of potential energy will be dissipated away in feedback form. So let's recapitulate. And again, this is a caricature of the helium core. So first, the iron core collapses into a black hole. Then the next shell of material is going to fall. And depending on if it has enough angular momentum, there will be a disk. Now, the binding energy of the star is much, much less than the potential energy that the black hole can release. So even if little mass is accreted, if that energy is sufficiently converted into feedback, the entire envelope is going to be ejected. And if that happens, we're going to see a very bright transient. On the other case, if a disk is not formed or the feedback is inefficient, everything just gets directly accreted onto the black hole and we see nothing. There is no bright transient. So let me discuss how the black hole will evolve as material falls into it, which is going to be very important to explain the direct collapse. So initially, the black hole has a certain mass and spin, and this determines the location of the innermost stable circular orbit of the black hole, or the ISCO. As material is accreted, the angular momentum of the black hole and the mass is going to change. Now, this is a formalism done by my collaborators Aldo and Enrico, where it is Aldo Bata and Enrico, where it is easier to understand how the black hole evolves if we divide this helium core in shells, and each shell is going to be accreted to the black hole. Each of the accreted shells will add a certain mass and certain angular momentum to the black hole, and this is all self-consistent. And the effect of the addition of mass and angular momentum will be extremely important for the final result of the star. So here in this plot, I'm plotting the energy as a function of the mass coordinate of the star. This is for a 30-ish solar mass star. And what this plot is going to tell is at what point does this formalism suggest that the envelope of this very massive star is going to be ejected. So this line right here represents the binding energy of the 30 solar mass helium core. And this line right here represents the binding energy, the same binding energy, just considering that the material is collapsing, so there's an additional kinetic energy term. These two different lines represent the binding energy from the feedback given a certain efficiency. There are two different lines that represent two different feedback mechanisms. So in this case, there is no losses. So everything that gets accreted gets added to the mass, so it gets added to the energy. So it's a cumulative term. Whereas in this case, if a shell gets accreted, it's not going to, and the shell is not enough to form a disk or appreciable feedback to unbind the envelope, it's not going to contribute. So these are the two extreme scenarios. So this is saying that somewhere around this line where the binding energy of the star is equal to the binding energy released by feedback, so somewhere around here, the envelope is going to be ejected. So what I want you to notice is that even in the worst case scenario, which is feedback with losses, the star that was originally 30 solar masses is going to eject its envelope, and it's going to end up releasing like 30% of its mass. And therefore, the black hole is only going to be around 70% of the original mass. So this can have a very important effect on the final product. And not only that, but also on the final spin of the black hole. So basically, I've hopefully convinced you that at high angular momentum, if a massive star is collapsing and it is forms, this high angular momentum flow can halt the collapse of the star and eject the envelope, and there will be a bright transient. But if there is no angular momentum, then the entire star gets accreted onto the black hole. And in that case, everything is directly accreted and there is no bright transient. So there must be a point between these two where there is a transient and there is no transient. And let's figure that out. So let's try to figure out what happens at very low angular momentum flows. Low enough so that a disk may or may not form. So let's try to simulate that. And let's think first about how particles fall into a black hole. So here what I'm plotting is several trajectory lines that a particle can have. So if the particle has no angular momentum, it will just have this kind of trajectory and be directly accreted onto the black hole right here. If it has very high angular momentum, it's going to have this kinds of trajectories where it's orbiting around the black hole. Now, the trajectories in B are actually the interesting ones. So those are particles that would be accreted onto the black hole, but at some point they cross the equator. So they do something like this. The thing is that if we have a particle coming in at this direction, because of symmetry, we're also going to have a particle that's coming in this direction. And it's going to encounter the other particle right here. There's going to be a cancellation of the vertical momentum, and there's going to be dissipation of energy. This will form a thin disk, and it will orbit the black hole a bit more. This is called a mini disk, and this could potentially carry enough energy that could help unbind the envelope, and it is important to then study them numerically, which is the project that I did. I studied what happens in these very low angular momentum cases. So I performed the simulations using HARM, which is a code that solves the equations of general relativity magnetohydrodynamic. And I just want to point out, this is an aside here, but please ask me about how to add neutrinos and tabulated equations of state in HARM, which is my thesis project. So that was an aside. Let's return to the simulations. So for the simulations, I'm going to focus on this region right here. And this is just, again, the helium core. Material will be falling onto the black hole, and we will be zoomed in this really, really small part right here. From now on, I'm going to use this length unit, which is called the gravitational radii, and it is basically half of the Schwarzschild radii. The angular momentum, of course, is going to be the key parameter in our simulations. So what we're going to do is we're going to assume constant angular momentum as a function of radius. And we're going to set it to be a fraction of the angular momentum at the ISCO, which is in theory the critical angular momentum in which a disk forms. I'm going to add this slowdown parameter right here. I'm going to call this a slowdown parameter, and it is a parameter that we will vary throughout the simulations. And we're also going to add an angular dependence, but this is just so that the angular momentum disappears at the boundaries. And from now on, I'm going to show these kinds of images, which are from their simulations. And this right here is just going to be this tiny circle. So this is going to be a very zoomed in version. Here it's going to be the black hole. And the magenta lines are going to be the velocity vectors that are going to show us how things fall into the black hole. So these are our initial conditions in the angular momentum. So let's see what happens, and let's see the results of our simulations. So here what I'm showing is the energy at a set time. And this is the energy from our simulations that have different slowdown factors. So this one has a slowdown factor of 0, which corresponds to no angular momentum. Everything is spherically symmetric. And this is called actually the Bondi accretion. Here I'm showing the energy at 70% of the angular momentum at the ISCO. The cyan line represents the ISCO. And I should just clarify that the ISCO, which is the innermost stable circular orbit, everything inside it is doomed to fall into the black hole. So we really only care about what happens outside of the ISCO, because that's the matter that's actually going to be able to produce the feedback. And again, these lines just represent the velocity vectors. So what's going to happen? This is just the normal spherical accretion case. And in this case, we're going to start to see accumulation of matter right around the equator. This is not surprising at all, because we already know that there are going to be streamlines going this way and streamlines going that way that are going to collide in the equator and are going to dissipate a bit of an energy and accumulate. So this is all not surprising. Now let's increase the angular momentum and see what happens. So if we do that, let's do 90% of the angular momentum at the ISCO. So as can be seen here, we can see more and more accumulation compared to the other case. Now our domain, let me just tell you, everything is supersonic inside our domain. So the energy accumulation, any energy that was accumulated is going to be advected onto the black hole. So there will be no feedback in those cases. Now let's increase the angular momentum a bit more to 1.1 the angular momentum at the ISCO. So now interesting things are starting to happen. Here, the energy dissipation rate is beginning to win over the advection rate. And there's going to be the formation of this hot bubble. Now this hot bubble in this case is inside the ISCO. So everything is just going to be accreted onto the black hole. And in this case, there will be no dissipation. But then what happens if we go even higher? Then if we do like 1.5 times the angular momentum at the ISCO, we have a fully formed bubble. Now the shock is already outside the ISCO, so we will have energy dissipation. There's going to be this high pressure buildup that will slow down the material that's coming into the black hole, and it will redistribute the angular momentum. Let me just show you a movie of what happens, and just so that you see how the shock is moving. Okay, I don't know why it's not working. Sorry, technical difficulties. Okay, now you can see it. So as you can see, the shock is moving pretty fast, and it's not only slowing the material down, but it's actually just like ramping it up outside. So this shock actually has enough ramp pressure in order to unbind the entire star, if it plows through the entire star. So this whole ramp pressure, sorry?
5 minutes.
Okay, so this whole ramp pressure of material is going to be expanding, and if it continues going through the entire star, the pressure is going to unbind it. So here I'm showing the position of the bubble in the equator for different slowdown factors as a function of time. So this is shock position and time. And what I want you to notice is that it is going at a pretty constant velocity, and I'm showing here the velocity. And I also want to say that the velocity at the edge of the domain, which can be considered an escape velocity, is around 0.07 c, which means that in the high slowdown factors, it has a velocity larger than the escape velocity, which means that it is going to blow up the entire star if it, well, not blow up, but it's going to unbind the envelope if it continues like that. So at what point will the feedback be efficient and a bubble will form? So here I'm plotting the integrated energy up to a certain radius compared to Bundy as a function of the slowdown factor. So what I want you to notice right here is that there is a very clear transition at around a slowdown factor of like 1.2, where here we don't have efficient feedback, and here we will have efficient feedback because we're going to have a rotationally supported structure that, due to MHD stresses, is going to then later dissipate the energy. So this is where the hot bubble is formed. Okay, so now that we know that at a slowdown factor of 1.2, there is a transition between efficient and inefficient feedback, we can use this in order to constrain the maximum angular momentum of disappearing stars. Because we want those disappearing stars to always have inefficient feedback and never eject the envelope. So what we need is then this condition right here, that the angular momentum at all radii of the star, it's less than the critical angular momentum, which is 1.2 times the angular momentum at the ISCO. Just notice that we're going to do everything self-consistent, and as shells fall into the black hole will change its mass and angular momentum, and then the angular momentum at the ISCO will change accordingly. So we're all going to be self-consistent. Just as a recapitulation of the disappearing stars, we have two of them. There's this very massive one at a low metallicity galaxy, and this 20-30 solar mass disappearing star. And here I'm just showing the HR diagram with MESA models, just so that we can also look at where the mass ranges are. And with the HR diagram, we estimated that the mass of this one is around 23 to 28 solar masses, and this one is 98 up solar masses. So the nice thing is that if we know the internal structure with MESA, which is a stellar evolution code, we can use the previous condition in order to get the maximum angular momentum. So this is what I'm showing right here. So here what I'm plotting is the angular velocity where this condition happens. So this line's right here as a function of the initial mass. So this line right here represents where this condition is unequal, which means that in this hatch region, we're going to have disappearing stars. So this will constrain the angular momentum of this N6946BH1 and the LBB. And we can go even further, because with this formalism, we can obtain a limit on the number of stars that should disappear without a transit. And the nice thing is that we have a set of massive O stars and we have the rotation rates. So there are these really nice observations from the VLT for the Tarantula survey in 30 Doradus. And these are the stars shown right here in the light blue. And what we can do is that if we assume rigid rotation with the MESA models, we can evolve those stars via this very simple relation, which is just saying the definition of the moment of inertia and the angular momentum. And we can evolve those and try to see what their angular momentum or their angular velocity is going to look like at the end of their lives, which is this blue stars right there. And we can do the same game and try to see where we're going to have disappearing stars, which is in this hatch region right here. So this is where there's going to be the limit between inefficient feedback and efficient feedback. So this means that these disappearing stars right here, we're going to predict that are going to just directly collapse and have no bright transient. Whereas this other bunch of stars are going to when they die, they're going to have a very bright transient. So from this sample, we obtained that around like 5% of the stars will end up disappearing without a bright transient. And the observational limit is around 7%, which is really nice. Now, let me just say a caveat that this number is highly dependent on the MESA models used. If we change, for example, the wind prescription even for a bit, this fraction can be like 7%. So it's actually relatively consistent. And now just let me end by saying my conclusions, that the direct collapse of a black hole of a slowly rotating, very massive star can result in a star that disappears without a bright transient. And we can use numerical simulations in order to constrain the maximum angular momentum of such stars. And then we can also use that to predict the fraction of massive star that will disappear without a transient. And we set that to be around 5%. And this will just be my final slide. Please also ask me about all these different topics because I'm really interested in all of them. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Ari, that's really great. Everyone can give a round of applause in the reactions menu here.
Thank you very much.
And we have time for some questions. So raise your hand if you have a question. Flora, go ahead.
Yeah, hey, great talk. I was wondering, so you were talking also in the last bit about like the MESA uncertainty. So is the uncertainty mostly coming from like how much hydrogen is on top of your star, or is it like that doesn't really matter since you're mostly looking at like the inner layers when you're considering like the disappearing?
Yeah, so I would say the second one. So mainly the change that I said was on the wind prescription. So we use like the very massive enlist, and we used the Dutch wind with the Dutch factor of like 0.8, and the 7% was with the Dutch factor of 1. So a much, much powerful wind that just changes the mass a lot, because like the 80 solar mass stars end up being like 50 solar mass with that kind of wind. It's a little bit crazy, but very interesting.
Thanks.
Thank you. Great question.
Any other questions? I have a quick one, if I may. I'm an observer, so of course I'm going to ask you about the observations.
Oh, well, I'm a theorist, but yeah, let's.
Yeah, no. So you mentioned this observational limit of 7%. Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit about where that comes from and like what are the prospects for improving that?
Well, so this is from the paper of N6946PH1, which is a really nice disappearing star. And they do that based on the fact that they observed one disappearing star in their survey, basically.
So is there any way we can, do we have to just keep doing the survey, basically?
Probably, yes. Okay. Just observing and observing more disappearing stars, which would be very interesting, by the way. Oh, and more on the Tarantula survey, like those rotation rates it's amazing that they found the rotation rates.
And we have a question from Stephen Wilner.
Hi, thanks. You may have said this, but I'm wondering what happens on that last graph at very low metallicity. Does it make it easier or harder for the stars to disappear?
Okay, so let me just put the presentation again. I'm guessing you mean this plot right here?
Sorry, no, it was the one, well, that would do, but that one, the one that showed the data.
Okay.
Yeah. So if those were much lower, well, this is 0.2. What if it was 0.02 or something?
So actually, I think that this plot would answer the question, because I mean, so these are all at the same metallicity because they're from the same, they're from 30 Doradus. So this one should show the difference, and mainly the difference is that at very low metallicities, so the main difference is at the very high mass ends, and this is probably more of an effect of the fact that the winds are going to be much stronger. So the final mass is going to be very different. So so that would be mainly the main difference, the winds. Sorry, yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Let's thank Ariadna again, and I will hand it over to Syria for the second speaker.
Thank you. So just a quick reminder to everybody, we are recording this talk and eventually this will go on YouTube. So now we have our second speaker, who is Sophie Koudmani, who was an undergrad at the University of Oxford and is now a final year graduate student at the University of Cambridge in the UK. She works with hydrodynamical simulations of AGN feedback on galaxies. Most people focus on the effect of AGN feedback on massive galaxies, but Sophie actually studies the effect of AGN feedback on low mass galaxies, which is a very exciting field, and can't wait to hear what she has to tell us about it. Go ahead, Sophie.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. I hope you can all see my screen. So yeah, hi, I'm Sophie Koudmani. Thanks to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present my research today. And I'm going to talk to you about the impact of AGN feedback on simulated dwarf galaxies. And this is work done together with my supervisor, Deborah Chijachki, as well as Nick Hendon, Martin Bourne, and Matthew Smith. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is mainly based on these two papers here on arXiv. I actually think you can't see my cursor, but that's fine. All right, so first of all, why do we actually need feedback in galaxy formation? So feedback is usually invoked to explain the mismatch between the galaxy mass function that is inferred from dark matter only simulations and the stellar mass function that is observed. So here the mismatch between the gray line from the halos and the black line from the stellar masses. And the common theoretical model is then that supernova feedback suppresses the low mass end, whilst AGN feedback suppresses the high mass end. However, this common theoretical model has been called into question by mounting observational evidence for AGN and dwarf galaxies across the whole stellar mass range. And I'm gonna highlight a few particular examples here. So actually, especially in the beginning, most of these AGN and dwarfs were identified via systematic searches of SDSS in combination with X-ray follow-ups. So I'm highlighting here a study by Chilingarian et al. 2018, where they identified 10 bona fide AGN and dwarfs, which is shown here, the SDSS images. And the red circle here shows you the position of the X-ray source. And actually, all of these AGN and the dwarfs are highly accreting. So they all have adding fractions above 1%, which sort of tells you that what we've got here is really only the tip of the iceberg. And there's also been concrete evidence for actual AGN feedback in dwarf galaxies. So for example, the MaNGA survey found that quiescent dwarf galaxies with AGN signatures are also associated with kinematically offset ionized gas, which you can see here in the picture down here. And this they interpret as a sign of AGN-driven outflows. And actually by now there's also been direct evidence for AGN-driven outflows in dwarfs, here by Manzano and King, as well as a more recent follow-up study from Leo et al. And there have also been systematic searches now at higher redshift, for example, in the Cosmos field, where both X-ray AGN and radio AGN up to redshifts 2 to 3 have been identified. And all of these very interesting and tantalizing observational studies have motivated theorists to look into this largely unexplored regime of AGN feedback at the low mass end. And analytical models and the general AGN energetics actually look pretty promising. As you can see here in this plot by Dashian et al. 2018, actually for most of the parameter space, AGN feedback should be more efficient than supernova feedback in driving the gas out of dwarfs. However, numerical studies have found a bit of a caveat to this, which is that if the supernova feedback is quite strong, it will hinder the growth of the black holes and render AGN feedback in low mass galaxies inefficient. However, if these black holes are allowed to grow efficiently, they can drive feedback and suppress star formation even at the low mass end. And it has also been pointed out that multi-messenger signatures will be a really important tool for constraining this black hole population at the low mass end. To investigate this, we have firstly used isolated simulations of dwarf galaxies to systematically test the direct impact of AGN feedback in the low mass regime. And these simulations were carried out with the moving mesh code AREPO. And here you can see cross sections of these mesh cells. So here in the center, we've got the disk and then so edge on view. And then out of the disk, you can see these outflows emanating. And here in the central region of the disk, where the black hole lies, we use the super Lagrangian refinement technique to increase the gas mass resolution. And this increased resolution then allows us to study different modes of AGN injection. So here on the left-hand side, you can see the simple isotropic thermal energy injection. And on the right-hand side, you can see a different feedback mode that we tested, which is mass-loaded bipolar outflows. And we also use a novel star formation and supernova feedback scheme in these simulations. So here you can see a movie of a subset of the simulation suite. So these are all isolated disk galaxies with stellar masses of approximately 2 × 10⁹ and a central black hole of mass 10⁵, which is quite typical for the dwarf galaxies that have been observed. So here in the top row, you can see the gas density, second row, gas temperature, and the last row shows you the vertical velocity. So we can see here again the disk, which is initially collapsing from the initial conditions, and the outflows. And here this first column is a run without any feedback, so not much is happening, no outflows. The second column is a run with only supernova feedback, and then the last 3 columns are different variants of AGN feedback. And for all of these AGN feedback runs, we set a constant high Eddington ratio, again matching these very highly accreting AGN and dwarfs that have been observed, to test the maximum impact, direct impact that an AGN could have on these systems. And what we can immediately see when we compare the supernova plus AGN runs to the supernova only runs is that for all of these variants, actually the outflows with AGN feedback are much hotter, and they're also significantly faster. However, despite this clear impact on the outflows, what we actually found is that there is no effect on the star formation rates by the AGN. So the supernova feedback already does a pretty good job at regulating star formation, and when you add AGN feedback on top, not much changes because actually most of the AGN energy also just escapes perpendicular to the disk. But we hypothesized that actually the AGN could still play an indirect role in quenching, because it is quite feasible that these powerful outflows that you can see here in the movies could push back cosmic gas inflows and then starve off the dwarf and regulate star formation in this way. But we can't test this with isolated simulations because we don't have a cosmological environment or cosmological inflows here. So this is why for my next project, I then moved on to analyze AGN feedback in low mass galaxies in the FABLE simulations. So the FABLE simulations are cosmological simulations with a galaxy formation model based on the illustrious simulation, but with updated supernova and AGN feedback. And here you can see projections of the gas density in the whole FABLE box at redshift 0 on the left-hand side and at redshift 1 on the right-hand side. And the markers here show you the distribution of all low mass galaxies that have an AGN, which is here defined as having an Eddington fraction of at least 0.1%. And we here define the low mass galaxy sample as galaxies with stellar masses up to the knee of the stellar mass function at 10 to the 10.5. And the marker type shows you the mass spin of these galaxies. So we here consider dwarfs, massive dwarfs, and M-star galaxies. And the marker color shows you the outflow rate at the virial radius. And for each mass spin, we zoom in on a representative example galaxy and show the structures of these outflows at the virial radius. So what you can see here is that at both redshifts and across all mass spins, actually we have pretty significant outflows that reach the virial radius. And all of these also have a fast component that is fast enough to escape the halo. However, before we start off with the proper analysis of the FABLE galaxies, there's one important caveat to mention, which is that, like most cosmological simulations, in FABLE, the supernova feedback has been tuned to be extremely strong to suppress the low mass end of the galaxy stellar mass function. But like I mentioned earlier in the introduction, strong supernova feedback significantly suppresses black hole growth, which then means that also the black hole luminosities are going to be suppressed, and therefore the impact of the AGN feedback. So what we've really got here with FABLE is a bit of a worst case scenario in terms of impact of AGN on low mass galaxies. So this is something to be kept in mind. So first then we analyze the AGN population in the low mass galaxies. So here the distribution of this population is plotted in Eddington fraction versus black hole luminosity space. And in the top row, the distribution is color-coded according to the stellar masses of the host galaxies. And in the bottom row, the color coding represents the ratio between the black hole luminosity and the total stellar luminosity of the galaxy. And the dashed line here shows you the Eddington fraction at 10 to the -2, where the black holes switch to the quasar mode. And what we can immediately see here at low redshift is that there are very few bright AGN. So actually only 1% of them are in the quasar mode. But as we study the distribution at higher redshifts, we get more and more bright AGN. So here at redshift 2, actually already 25% of AGN in low mass galaxies are in the quasar mode, and this then increases to 51% in the quasar mode at redshift 4. And this is quite exciting because this high redshift regime will be able to be probed with new facilities like the Roman Space Telescope or JWST or Athena. So there are very exciting prospects coming up. And the lower row shows you another issue with looking for AGN and dwarfs, especially here at low redshifts, which is that most of them are outshone by the stellar component. So then we really need multi-wavelength and or resolved observations to be able to find these. So these kind of approaches will become very important if we want to study the local AGN population. We then also looked at the scaling relations at the low mass end. So here on the left-hand side, you've got the black hole mass versus stellar mass scaling relation. And on the right-hand side, the black hole mass versus gas mass scaling relation. And the black line here shows you the mean relation from FABLE. And we also plot the whole binned distribution of the FABLE low mass galaxies, color-coded by the outflow rate at the virial radius. And where there are fewer than 10 objects per bin, we just plot the individual objects here, also color-coded by the outflow rate. So then we can sort of see the mean behavior of the population, but we can also see the behavior of outliers. And for comparison, for the black hole mass versus stellar mass relations, we also plot some of the observed scaling relations. Now, as you can see, this is still quite unconstrained at the low mass end, but mostly people extrapolate to the low mass end using late type scaling relations because the low mass end is dominated by late type galaxies. And as you can see by looking at these two relations from Jenny Green 2019, this actually is pretty crucial. Here the upper one is a scaling relation derived from their whole sample, including all of the galaxies, whereas the lower relation here only includes the late type galaxies, and actually the difference is 0.7 DEX. So we find that the FABLE low-mass galaxies are broadly in agreement with the observed late-type scaling relations, but they are undermassive compared to most of them. So this yet again hints at the fact that the black hole growth in FABLE might be unphysically suppressed, so that we've really only got a lower limit of the impact of AGN. And another interesting thing to note, if you look here at the black hole mass versus gas mass scaling relation, if we compare black holes that are overmassive, so up here with respect to the scaling relations to the undermassive population, we see that the overmassive black holes on average have significantly higher mass outflow rates. So this then really piqued our interest. If the overmassive black holes at fixed gas mass drive higher outflow rates, which other galaxy properties might also be correlated with overmassive black holes? So to this end, we then plotted various outflow properties and galaxy properties versus gas mass here. And the black line again shows you the mean scaling relation, but then we also plot the distribution of all of the low mass galaxies. But this time we color code them according to whether the average black hole in the spin is overmassive or undermassive with respect to the given gas mass. So red here is overmassive black hole and blue is undermassive black hole. And again, when there are fewer than 10 objects per bin, we just plot the individual objects. And we can immediately see that for all of these different properties plotted here, that when you color code according to overmassive or undermassive black holes, actually you split the distributions into two quite clear populations. But yeah, this is a quite busy plot, so let's go through it column by column. So we find that for overmassive black holes at fixed gas mass, both the outflow and the inflow rates are larger, so that for the total mass flow rate, you then get this bimodal distribution because the overmassive black holes are both associated with extreme outflow rates and extreme inflow rates. Furthermore, for overmassive black holes, we get faster and hotter outflows. We get reduced gas fractions and higher black hole luminosities. And we also get that the mass loading factor is increased, whilst the specific star formation rate is suppressed. So this is now for the overmassive black holes at fixed gas mass, but we wanted to see whether we would observe similar effects for overmassive black holes at fixed stellar mass, even though, as you might remember from the previous plot, the relationship was quite a bit tighter. So this is now the equivalent plot, plotting the same quantities, but against stellar mass and color coding according to the offsets from the black hole mass stellar mass relation. So broadly, we do recover similar trends. So for example, here for the overmassive black holes, the outflow rates are enhanced, but it's not nearly as clear cut as for the overmassive black holes at fixed gas mass. And of course, that makes sense because gas abundance really is the main driver of black hole activity, because on the one hand, the gas supplies the fuel for the black hole. And on the other hand, you really need to have a certain amount of gas around to even be able to drive these large scale outflows and establish these correlations. But there is also one clear difference. So if we look here at the last column, if you remember, we had that mass loading factors were increased and specific star formation rates were suppressed. However, this is now no longer true down here in the Dwarf regime. Actually, the specific star formation rates are not suppressed at all. If anything, they're enhanced. So this then really indicates that here at Redshift 0, supernova feedback is still the dominant feedback mechanism in dwarfs, and the black holes are not doing much. And we get similar trends at Redshift 1. However, you might remember from earlier that at higher redshift, the AGN luminosities significantly increased. So we wanted to see whether maybe the black hole could then also do a better job at suppressing star formation. So here I'm plotting the specific star formation rate versus the stellar mass for redshift 2, 3, and 4. And here in the upper row, again, it's color-coded according to overmassive or undermassive black holes. And it's now clear that at high redshift, actually overmassive black holes are correlated with suppressed specific star formation rates down to the dwarf regime. And this effect is even more clear if instead of above average black hole masses, we consider above average black hole mass to gas mass ratios here in the lower panel, where brown stands for an above average black hole mass to gas mass ratio, and this is clearly correlated with specific suppressed specific star formation rates. So here at high redshift, the black hole is really able to drive the gas out of the galaxy and contribute to quenching. We then also wanted to assess whether there might be observational signatures of this black hole activity. So like I mentioned earlier, the MaNGA survey found that dwarfs with AGN signatures are more likely to have kinematically misaligned gas, so that the difference in kinematic position angles, which basically give you the orientation of the angular momentum vector of the gas and the stars, are greater than 30 degrees. And they interpret that as a possible sign of AGN-driven outflows. So we wanted to see whether we would also see that effect in FABLE. So we created mock MaNGA line of sight velocity maps for the FABLE dwarfs. And we found that indeed galaxies with overmassive black holes are more likely to be misaligned. So here you can see some of our mock maps. And the first column shows you the mock maps of the stars, and the second column of the ionized gas. And for comparison, we also show the line of sight velocity of the whole gas phase at the original resolution of the simulation. And this dashed black circle gives you the size of the MaNGA aperture. However, we found that these offsets that you can see here in the kinematic position angles are not always caused by fast outflows. They can cause misalignment, as here for the massive dwarf, where this redshifted feature is driven by an outflow, but other factors such as recycling, cosmic inflows, or mergers are also important. For example, here, where the redshifted feature is caused by an inflow for the M-star galaxy. And of course, cosmic inflows or mergers will also trigger AGN activity. So the misalignment would still be correlated with AGN activity, but not caused by the AGN itself. And finally, we also compared to X-ray data that I mentioned earlier. Like I said, this X-ray data really only constrains the tip of the iceberg. So these X-ray observations are only complete for the highest X-ray luminosity bins, but one can then still use that to measure the AGN fraction in these high luminosity bins as it's shown here. So this is the AGN fraction versus redshift for two high X-ray luminosity bins, which are given by the figure titles. And I plot here the observed data points, but I also show the ones from the simulation here as the dark orange hexagons and the dark blue hexagons. And to get an idea of the uncertainty in the simulated values, I also show the AGN fractions from 3 FABLE calibration runs as gray hexagons. But even with taking these gray hexagons into account, we find that there are no FABLE objects with bright X-ray luminosities at low redshift. So once again, this indicates that most likely, especially in the local universe, the black hole growth in FABLE is unphysically suppressed. At intermediate redshift, there's actually quite good agreement with the observations. And then at high redshift, we predict that the AGN fraction should rise rapidly. And this will be testable by future X-ray missions like Athena or Lynx. And yeah, if you are interested, I'm also at the moment working on zoom-in simulations, varying the supernova feedback to see if that could help make the AGN accretion more efficient. And I'm also working on a new subgrid model for AGN accretion. And I'd be happy to chat about both of these. I still have some meeting slots available. So I'll leave you with my conclusions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a really nice talk, very clear, very nice slides. So people can use the raise hand feature on Zoom to ask questions. I think I'm going to start with my question, which is, so how much should we worry about the supernova feedback? Like, I think you explained very clearly that this is a bit of a circuitous issue, like the supernova feedback has been chosen so that everything works out without AGN in dwarfs, but now you show that AGN in dwarfs can actually do something. But you know, how is there like an intrinsic degeneracy and we need way better data, or how can we get out of this?
Yeah, I definitely agree. This degeneracy has to be broken with data. Like I said, there's already some data that constrains this, like these X-ray AGN fractions, where, for example, FABLE is not able to reproduce these highly accreting AGN. So this could be one condition, that the supernova feedback can't be so strong that the AGN are not able to reach these high accretion rates, or at least some of them need to be able to reach it. But of course, what I couldn't even get into is that there are even more degeneracies. So for example, just the AGN accretion prescription is also really important. And most cosmological simulations use the Bondi rate, which is of course proportional to the square of the black hole mass, and will then suppress the growth of low mass black holes by construction. So that's another factor to take into account, that it's not just the supernovae, but also the AGN accretion recipe.
Yeah, that's a good point. We have a question from Martin. You're muted, we can't hear you.
Sorry, yes. I wonder if you could get an interesting constraint from the X-ray background, the residual X-ray background after you take out the known sources, which is like 90-something% resolved. Would the summed emission from all these objects provide any useful constraint?
Yeah, that would be really interesting. Yeah, and then try and compare that, I guess, to large-scale cosmological boxes. Yeah, that would give you a really good idea also of this faint population, which at the moment is completely unconstrained. So yeah, that's a great idea.
We have time for one more question. Brian?
Great talk. So I'm wondering, so the FABLE prescription for high accretion rate feedback in this like quasar mode, is it exactly identical to Illustris? Because I understand that Illustris kind of injects thermal energy that's almost immediately kind of radiated away and doesn't make that much of an impact, especially in terms of like cold gas outflows like that aren't reproduced. So is FABLE different in that way, or is it doing the same kind of thing?
Yeah, FABLE is different in the quasar mode feedback, so that it has this duty cycle implemented. So it saves up the energy for 25 mega years and then releases it all at once. So sort of at least partly overcoming this overcooling problem. So the quasar mode is then more efficient than it is in Illustris.
Cool, thanks.
We have one last question. Okay, if not, let's thank our speakers again, and I'll remind you that you can still sign up on their schedule if you want a one-on-one meeting. Thank you all, and see you next week.